Hey, hi. What's energizing you? What's motivating you these days? I've been trying to keep up with all of the 2025 trend reporting that's out there. I finished Adobe's report, and I'm fascinated with their take on nostalgia and futurism. I enjoyed Pinterest's annual perspective. They proposed 20 trends in kind of look and color and style for next year, but really, there's only one worth paying attention to, and that one is pickle fix. That's the winning trend for 2025. Pickles in everything. Pickle fix. Well, today's episode, our fourth Curiosity+Courage podcast, is definitely going to be much more satisfying. I met our guest because of TikTok. This is probably 2 years ago. I was getting my daily swirl of home renovation gurus and drummers and AI evangelists and counterculture aficionados. And all of a sudden, the algorithm served up this really smart woman talking about creative briefs and the nature of an actionable insight. And she nailed it. And I thought, who is this? The profile was Stuff About Advertising. And I came to really appreciate everything she was posting. So on Mondays, she puts out a recap of weekly trends and campaigns. And then later in the week, she might be talking about advertising craft or brand strategy. And her feed is really accessible, but also nuanced and wise. Stuff About Advertising has a distinct voice. She's got perspective. She's delivering the goods. Of course, I followed her. And then I went down the rabbit hole. I checked out her YouTube channel, and wouldn't you believe it? There's even more useful content with longer form explanations and digressions. She's got an entire training program online, and you can also find her on Instagram. So then I thought, I'm going to hire this Stuff About Advertising person for a freelance project that I was working on. Unfortunately, the project fizzled, but I found out her name was Ashley Rutstein. And so when I started this interview podcast series, Ash was at the very top of my list. Here's a writer who has deep respect for the history and craft of advertising, deep insight into the value and purpose of branding, and a knack for explaining all of it very simply. As you'll hear, Ashley is a social entrepreneur. She grew up on YouTubers. She's got a native fluency for the media environment that we're living within today. And she's mixing all of that together across various platforms to serve as an advocate for advertising, creativity, and ideas. I'm so thrilled she agreed to talk. Here's my conversation with Ashley Rutstein. So, what's the last song that you've listened to that made an impact? What song resonates? What's in your head?
I mean, I was just listening to my Spotify Wrapped playlist.
Okay. What's your number one?
My number one song is a collab between All Time Low and Avril Lavigne called Fake as Hell.
Okay.
Just talking to someone about how they're fake.
Yeah.
That was, I think, a song that I was listening to in January of this year. So it was like, I guess I was angsty in the beginning of the year. But
Yeah. I love the rap for like reminding you, in my case, like I play the drums. And so occasionally I'll get brought into a situation like, hey, there's a Tom Waits tribute band. Can you play the show? And so I'll get the set list on Spotify. And so I'm listening to these Tom Waits songs a lot to get prepared for the show. And so, of course, Spotify's like, well, you love Tom Waits.
yeah.
He's your number one album. It's like, it's actually more work related, but okay, I kind of get it.
That's like how my kid affected my Spotify because he's obsessed with the Wheels on the Bus right now. So we've been playing the Wheels on the Bus at least 5 times a day, usually more. So I was very nervous that my Spotify Wrapped would look a little childish.
But that is such a common thing with like parents and kids. And I remember long before I have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, like before they ended up having their own Spotify accounts, their interests would pollute whatever it was that was showing up. And you're like, that's not really who I am, Spotify, but hey. So I'm just curious, like, where'd you grow up? Like what was the environment that inspired you to find yourself into the world of advertising?
I grew up in a lot of places because my dad was in the military, so we moved
Oh, okay.
around every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Um, I think that definitely gave me this skill of adaptability that is
Mhm.
so important in the industry for
Yeah.
many reasons, but also because, you're working on a different client, different project, different
Mhm.
industry constantly. So that helped me a lot. I was also a big reader as a kid. I was
Mm.
constantly reading. I'm an only child, so I had to,
Mm.
keep myself busy somehow.
Yeah.
So it was either books or video games.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I did a lot of crafts and artsy things with my mom. And then I
Mhm.
somehow decided I wanted to be a pharmacist.
Yeah,
So
as one does.
as one does after reading and doing artsy things. I went to college with that in mind. Like, I was a chemistry major up until sophomore year when
Yeah.
organic chemistry completely changed my mind, as I
Mm.
think it does for a lot of people. I, I couldn't do organic chemistry for a semester, let alone 5 more years for pharmacy school. So
Right.
I went to my advisor and I was like, please help me. I feel like this is not right for me. Um, and at the time, I had a YouTube channel where I just made little skits and funny, whatever I had in my head. I just put my laptop camera on and filmed it. And I was huge into YouTube. I loved watching vloggers and people who just filmed their lives and little funny rants that they had in their heads, and
Mhm.
my advisor helped me realize that that could be an indication that that's the direction I need to go. So, luckily, there was, like, a brand new major that had just come out that semester that I was having this crisis, and it was a combination of the IT program and the communications program. So, it was
Mm.
essentially digital marketing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that I was like, "Yes, this completely clicks with what's going on in my head right now, what I wanna do," and I that's how I got into social media at an agency and then kind of fell into copywriting from there.
Yeah. Okay. That's so much of it is kind of the luck of your circumstances
Mhm.
and that one person, who's like, "Hey, I noticed this thing about you. Have you ever thought about," and all of a sudden a door opens and a career takes off. But I'm curious about the YouTube thing. So, um, we're of a different era. I'm a jaded Gen Xer. And so like I remember seeing like, like the internet shows up and we're having to explain to people, what an ISP is, while their VCR is blinking 12. And so I was never a person, I was never kind of drawn towards like YouTubing. My 17-year-old absolutely like wanted to start a channel and all of that stuff. What how did you get into that? Like how did you what was your sort of first inclination of like, "Oh, yeah, YouTube, and I should be telling my story in this global platform?"
I think it was the prevalence of the daily vloggers, the people
Mm,
who I mean, I used to watch
yeah.
this guy named Charles Trippy who
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think he's still vlogging every single day of his life, and he was for multiple years when I was watching. Um, and that just kind of brought entertainment down to a place that I felt was approachable and something that anyone could do. Um, Even if you don't have a particularly exciting life, you could be funny, you could have funny things to say, and you can just film a video and people might watch. And my roommate and I at the time were just obsessed with YouTubers, and we were like, "Maybe we can do this. We can be YouTubers." So we just decided to make our own videos, and I loved creating things. It still hadn't clicked in my head that I needed to be in a creative field. Like, I loved being creative, but somehow I was off doing chemistry, so it just hadn't made sense to me quite then.
Yeah, it's interesting how since social media, sort of post social media and kind of like the enabling capability of smartphones and then platforms, I look at things like CapCut and the idea that like you don't have to go to school, you don't need to have, an obsessive amount of
Mhm.
information to make something, right? It quite literally is hit record and go. Um, and that has definitely like unlocked so many more people into the world of creativity just in general. Um, and then some of those folks, kind of continue just telling the stories that they're telling, making the content that they're making. And some of them wind up in advertising or wind up in marketing or wind up in some other related field. And so we've got this kind of cohort of people who grew up making and telling stories. And I kind of look at like where we're at now with like news. And as a question I want to talk a little bit about later, but when you think about where do people get their information from, we've kind of like entered this honestly like a whole new era, I think, in terms of who are gatekeepers. Or do
Mhm.
gatekeepers even exist? Just and one example is like I'm looking at like the way news is told, and I get my news from TikTok and subscriptions to various newsletters. That's it.
Right.
I this tsunami thing. I was like, wait a second. I guess I'll go over to like I don't know Threads, Blue Sky. You know, like see what they say. Um, so in your process of like you had a roommate, so you guys were collaborating together, and then you saw Trippy and you saw other people, and then you got into social and in terms of agencies. Like, what do you think about creative people in general? Like, what distinguishes the ones that stand apart? The ones that are successful. Like, what habits or attributes do you kind of like identify as oh that's what makes that person a successful creative person?
Mhm. It's interesting because advertising and the creative within advertising, it's art, but I like when people say that it's art with a job
Mhm.
because artists can do whatever the heck they want, and it can mean whatever they want it to mean. We have to create art that solves business problems,
Mhm.
and I think I have such a combination left, right brain tendency, and so it just totally fit for me where I wanna be creative, but I also need a task. I need something to work towards. I want creative boundaries, and advertising creative just totally fits that.
Yeah. Do you know Mark Fensky, the writer Mark Fensky? But he said that advertising is art in the service of business. you
Mhm,
know? And to your mind, yeah, it's that, yes, you need to be creative, but there has to be a task. There has to be kind of a pointed focus for the art. When you think about successful designers or art directors, are there specific habits or character attributes that allow some to be more successful than others? Or maybe think about it in terms of not just, oh, that person over there and all of their awards, but more like collaborators. Like when you work
mhm.
with other people, what identifies the creatives in your mind that like are great to work with?
I think it's all curiosity and a willingness to explore and try new things. There are plenty of people that I've worked with who have no sense of curiosity and are just comfortable where they're at and just wanna
Mhm.
get their work done and that's it. But there are also a lot of people who are so curious and are really excited to learn something new and wanna dive deeper and find all the ins and outs of something, and those are the people that tend to be more successful, at least in my experience. They just have this hunger to do something different and try something new, and I also think that extends outside of work too for a lot of these people because when I think about my favorite people to work with, all of them have some type of passion or hobby outside of work that keeps them fulfilled and energized, whether it's music or gardening or reading or writing books or whatever it is. They all have something that just keeps them going and keeps them curious and explorative. And then also, you have all these other life experiences to draw on for ideas. Those people just tend to be so much more interesting in the work that they're
Mm.
producing.
Yeah, and then there's a point where, as you've noticed, you recognize, oh, this who I am, a person who is curious about these things, can be kind of constrained and focused on a task like advertising, right? Or
Mhm.
graphic design or content creation, right? Like there is a way to actually make a living doing it. Um, so kind of broadening this out and thinking about like the business of art, right? The business of creativity and problem solving. Like for you, like one of the things I had to, in preparation for this, I had to go back and watch a bunch of your YouTube videos, and especially about creative briefing, because that's like for me is a, a rich, potent area. I love, it's that document or that moment in time that serves as kind of like a crux, like before the creative brief, there was a problem. After the creative brief, in theory, optimally, there's a group of people who are uniquely empowered to change the world, right? Like at the end of the day, the best creative briefs, you know, turn into campaigns that create all kinds of, make careers for people, change the world, change
Hmm.
behavior, so there's an interesting potency to the brief. And so how did you discover like you had a point of view about briefs, I guess, and like what instigated specifically like your YouTube content? Because you're trying to explain. Like I had so much empathy with your explanations. I'm like, yes, someone is explaining like why this matters and what's the difference between an insight and an idea. Like, bring me into that.
I mean, I've always been a very opinionated person. I, um, I think ever since I started getting briefs, I've had opinions on them
Yeah.
because this brief is setting me up to do my job, and
Mhm.
if it's not good, I'm not set up to do my job.
Right. Yeah.
So it it either makes my job harder because the brief just sucks and isn't giving me the information it should, or it's giving me too much information.
Mhm.
And now I want a creative box to work in, but sometimes those boxes can be way
Mhm.
too small or even
Mhm.
feel like a tightrope, honestly, because of how much we have to align our ideas with whatever's in the brief.
Mhm.
Um, so I think too much is given to us in a brief. I want
Mhm.
the most basic information, like what the business is trying to do or what problem they're trying to solve, who we're talking to, and that's kind of it. Let us creatives do the discovery
Mhm.
on how that can all come to life. But I feel like a brief is like, here's a headline or a tagline that you need to work against, and here's the
Right.
exact emotion that we're putting. It just everything is figured out. And that's our job as creatives to do that. And we want to bring as many different ways of answering this business problem as possible. But instead, we're bringing 5 ideas that all ladder up to the exact same little phrase or whatever it is. So I just wish that there was, um, less given to
Yeah.
us in the beginning.
The there's the John Steele's book, Truth Lies in Advertising. He was the planner behind the Got Milk work for, the
Mhm.
legendary Got Milk work. And I mean, ultimately, the success there was the deprivation strategy that like they had all these different ways of thinking about it. And then they realized, wait a second, when we asked people like, just don't use milk for a week and now write about how you feel, it was like, oh,
Mhm.
there's the insight, that ultimately led to, Good Bee's success in that space. I often think about a brief. A brief does two things. It has to inform, like, okay, right, well, what are we talking about? Who's it for? But the second thing it has to do is kind of inflame. Like,
Mhm.
I would hope that whether the brief is a document or a meeting, or I had a friend of mine, a planner who said now they're using Google's Notebook LM. And so they're
Oh, yeah.
taking the documents, generating a podcast, and maybe editing a little bit, but saying, hey, why don't you listen to this conversation? And then we can have a conversation and that will kind of become the brief, right?
That's
Because
interesting.
a brief doesn't have to be a document. I mean, certainly helps, but it could be a walk through a museum, right? It could be
Mhm.
whatever. But the inflaming part is it has to give you, the creative person, some sense of hope, some sense of like, A, I can do this. B, oh, you want me to like hit a bases loaded home run. Like you want me to conquer the world. Like, all right. Yeah, and it is going to be juicy and interesting and all of the above. So um you sort of outlined it a little bit to say, like essentially who is this for and what's it for? The sort of Seth Godin kind of constructs.
Right.
Like, do you have an example? Can you give me an example of like a brief that like sort of typified your ultimate kind of request?
I think I can't remember exactly what this brief was, but we did a campaign for an addiction recovery center. And I remember the brief of that talked about that we were talking to both people who have experienced addiction and their loved ones, which was, I think, important. But B, the sort of insider tension that was included in that brief was all of the fluffy, aspirational, positive, frolicking in a field sort of PSAs around addiction are annoying to the people who we're talking to. And that was really eye-opening for us as a creative team because we were like, "This is great. We can go against this and do something totally different." And that was
Yeah.
very energizing for us. And we ended up making something super raw and emotional and lo-fi, and it was so great, and it made people cry. It made the people who have experienced addiction say, "Wow, I've never seen anything like this before." And it was just such powerful work because the brief gave us a really good tension to work off of, but it wasn't too limiting at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It didn't tell you what to do. I think that's
Exactly.
oftentimes the brief is more of a mandate and less of a brief doesn't suggest that the word doesn't mean all of the answers.
Mhm.
It's a starting point. And well, I've been sober for 14 years. So I'm gonna have to look up
Congratulations.
your campaign
Yeah.
and see how I feel about it. Cause I agree, like all the fluffy stuff is like, no.
Yeah, exactly. It's annoying to them, and it also just wouldn't stand out because you've just
Yeah.
seen so much of it. And um, another thing that I think is frustrating to see in a brief is creative language, where it's not just thematic language or strategic language. It's like they wrote a tagline or wrote a headline or something that's in there, and I'm fine with it as long as the client doesn't see it, because clients latch onto those so easily, and then we have to ladder up every idea to this exact piece of language, and that really, really limits the ideas.
Yeah. Well, it's like, look, if you've solved the problem, great. Go
Yeah.
sell it. Go do it.
Uh-huh.
That's no, no, no. You've solved it. You get to
Yeah.
your turn.
Uh-huh.
um, let's just say you've got a great brief and you've got, you know, I guess the pivot is into thinking about clients.
Mhm.
In your mind, like what's the optimal way or the best way to get someone who may or may not consider themselves creative, but they're purchasing, they've commissioned
Mhm.
you, um, they've commissioned the team, the agency, what have you, to change their business circumstances. We have a problem, not enough people are doing X or not enough customers are doing Y. The brief essentially is a mechanism to get to ideas that will change all the behaviors.
Mhm.
How do you go about presenting work? Like, what's your kind of methodology for like you got the brief, it's part of that process. I'm looking for kind of the linkage from, in theory, the clients agreed on the assignment and the brief.
Mhm.
You have interesting, engaging work. Like, what's your process for bringing a client along and kind of helping them kind of agree in advance that, hey, this idea is going to be a good idea?
I try to make everything more of a conversation than a presentation because it makes the client feel like they're part of it. Like it was their idea too, or they were part of the process of coming up with the idea. I've heard a lot of this talked about on there was a podcast with Jason Bagley and Chris Beresford Hill, and they talked about how they get the clients on board by letting them in on the process, like
Mhm.
calling them up in the middle of concepting and saying, "Hey, we had this really cool idea. It's based on this insight, whatever." And it's just a phone call. It's super low pressure.
Mhm.
The client isn't, in a boardroom on
Right.
Zoom with a deck in front of them. It's just such a different vibe if you bring them in and let them see behind the scenes, because a lot of times it's like you get the brief, client goes away for a month, and then you come back and it's this super buttoned up professional presentation, and there's so much pressure on that.
Yeah.
So changing the circumstances of that, bringing it down to earth, letting them feel involved, they will always be more receptive in that
Yeah.
circumstance.
It's like, who says that we have to follow this like timeline and sort of formality? It's
Mhm.
like in some cases it helps. There's a really great interview with, I think it's Tim Ferriss and Chris Beresford Hill. Um, because Ferriss is marketing adjacent.
Mhm.
Um, but he's obviously not an advertising person. And so like they had an interesting conversation about kind of that point of view in terms of like, yeah, how do you get people to embrace something that is radical and new and fresh and maybe surprising,
Mhm.
what I'm hearing you say is like part of it is like, well, don't make a big deal out of it. You know,
Yeah.
you've as a younger person really got into the whole like YouTube creator, TikTok, and now you're at a point where, as you said, you've got a lot of people, engaging with you on TikTok. Like, how has all of that helped you like see yourself or like solve advertising problems? Because in a way, like I'm not an influencer. Um, but I'm curious, like, you've got a range of experience and kind of a platform that how does that inform the way that you kind of approach your typical advertising problem?
I think it's loosened me up a lot.
Mm.
Um, Something that's so great about TikTok and honestly, like, modern advertising now is anything goes.
Yeah.
Literally any niche, any, kind of humor, any level of quality or lack of quality, anything is possible now. Anything can perform well. So I've never been a proponent of best practices. I mean, as a creative, we usually don't like best practices, but I think even more so now, I see that best practices just hold you back because if you if it makes sense for your brand or whatever you're talking about, anything goes. So
Yeah.
loosen up and do whatever feels right, regardless of what a testing company is telling you to do or what best
Right.
practices are telling you to do. TikTok is a huge, huge example of that.
I mean, I think about this is early days of the internet. I was at an agency in Boston and VoIP, the like voice over IP telephone
Mhm.
technology was new. And the client was I think they were purchasing something like 10% of every banner ad on the internet. Like the volume of work that we were producing for this, I wasn't at that, I was adjacent to it, but the volume of work that the agency was producing for this particular client was absurd. Like, so from
Mhm.
a writing standpoint, it was like, hey, can you write like 50 headlines today? And all of them are going to run.
Oh
And what
gosh.
the client said, which was really interesting, was like, hey, we don't need a creative director, right? Because I want if we agree to the rules about what this brand is generally and kind of like how it speaks, create whatever you want and basically beat the top 10. So they had a
Mm.
leaderboard of the creative that was performing the best in terms of like against the target. And sometimes it was interesting, like, hey, this creative is performing best on Tuesdays, but not on Saturdays, but you had this leaderboard of what essentially the internet likes these ideas. And so your job as a creative person was beat the internet, right? And the client was like, so long as you're sticking within the brand guidelines,
Mhm.
you're free to do whatever you want. And I think that's kind of a lesson that TikTok is trying to teach us, that like, hey, understand your brand, but your brand may have nooks and crannies and aspects to it that could really connect with people if only you just gave it a shot,
Yeah.
you know?
That sense of freedom is so, so important, especially on a place like TikTok where things move very quickly. I mean, I've talked to so many people about how they would love to do more on TikTok for their brand, but the levels of approvals and the timelines and getting it through legal and all this stuff, they can never capitalize on a trend or something. And that's incredibly frustrating. But the companies that I've worked with where I've had to help them set their team up basically to make TikTok content. I
Mhm.
try to push that idea, like you're saying, have 1 or 2 people that have the freedom to make what they want to make. As long as they are super knowledgeable about the brand, they have a list of legal guidelines to watch out for,
Hmm.
you know, give them those creative boundaries, but
Right.
otherwise let them make and just
Right.
go. That's what
Right.
you have to do on TikTok.
Right. And put it out there. And I think the flip side of that is, and then learn.
Mhm.
I think we still work with a lot of marketers who kind of, I think, use the bureaucracy that you described as a kind of a mechanism for protecting themselves. Like, oh, well, I don't have to think too hard or like risk too much because I can say, well, legal, or well, we really need to review. And so the speed of an environment like TikTok is kind of terrifying in a way,
Mhm.
and it's just easier to kind of go, well, the bureaucracy is going to kind of protect us over here. Um, yeah, so like I look at the amount of like churn and change, and that's kind of reminding me of like, the internet arrived, Al Gore invented the internet, and all of a sudden, I mean, I remember art directors resisting. Do we have to put www dot, vw.com
Mhm.
on my print ad or at the end of my TV spot? And then all of a sudden, it became a thing that was like, well, of course, like to the point where it's just how about just vw.com, to the point where like they're gonna find it via, we went through this bubble and like, don't even bother with the URL,
Mhm.
they'll find us via Google. How do you kind of make sense? How do you help other creative people? How do you help clients? Like there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of change. How do you help people get comfortable with it, especially as like AI is coming around it? And
Mhm.
like, how do you coach other human beings to kind of like think about and maybe even welcome and embrace and take advantage of this technological pace that we're in?
I always encourage them to just try whatever new thing has
Mhm.
popped up. Get on the platform, download the app, make an account, explore it. I think the there are still people who are hesitant about TikTok even,
Yeah.
and those people, I can almost guarantee, haven't spent more than 5 seconds on the app.
Right.
They don't know what it is because they haven't tried it, and because of that, it's unknown, it's scary, it feels like
Hmm.
it's gonna take their job, or it feels like it's trivial because they think it's just teenagers dancing, whatever it
Hmm.
is. A
Right.
lot of that hesitancy is because they haven't experimented with it.
Hmm.
I love experimenting with new platforms. Every time there's a new one that comes out, I immediately get an account and flip through it and see what it's all about. Like, I remember since I started in social media, I remember there was a new platform called Jelly. I don't know if that
Uh,
rings a bell for you.
yeah. Yep. I think I was on Jelly
Um,
for like a week.
yeah, it was a quick one, but I remember, I was running a team at that point, and I went to the client the day it came out. We made a little deck, me and my team, about what Jelly is and how we could use it,
Yeah.
and convinced him to let us just experiment on it. And, it didn't last, obviously, but it was so much fun, and it energized us as a team, and it just gets you more adaptable to whatever comes up. So I constantly encourage people, like, please get on there and try it. And every time I've worked as a freelancer with a team, especially when it comes to TikTok, I highly encourage every single person who's going to be an approver needs to be on the platform. You don't get to say yes or no if you don't know what this platform is about.
Amen. So yeah, I think like the smart market, what I'm hearing you say is that smart marketers would require their teams to be enmeshed and fluent in the
Yes.
platforms that they're going to be running work on. Well, let's segue into AI as a means of getting into it. Paula Scher, the world famous designer at Pentagram, they just released a beautiful website for the U.S. government, and I think it's around like performance or something like that. And there's a great article in like Fast Company and things like that about her process, but the team essentially realized, hey, for the situation we're in, for the constraints we have to meet, for the objectives we're trying to achieve, um, we're going to use Midjourney, and we're going to use it as one of the tools in addition to other ones to help us create the they needed an incredible volume of icons and iconography.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you got a lot of people who, much like we'll talk about Jaguar, who are like, "Ugh, no, I can't believe you, Polisher, would do this." But other people are like, nah, I understand it. It's a tool. Where do you stand when you look at AI today, and what are you using AI for?
I have so many mixed feelings about AI, and I think that comes across pretty clear in the content that I make. Um, I think the power of it is just astonishing, and there's nothing like it that we've ever experienced before. And I think that's why there's a lot of questions still about it, because we don't know to the extent of how we're going to use this and why and what the
Right.
regulations are. And there's so many questions.
Right.
Um, I personally use AI every day.
Hmm.
Um, but I when I talk to junior people, I tell them not to use it. Uh, because the way I use it is as a creative director
Hmm.
directing a junior creative. The
Yeah.
AI
Yeah.
is essentially a junior.
Yep.
And the reason that works for me is because just like a creative director, I go to it and I say, here's what we need to do. Here are all my thoughts and direction on tone and phrases I want to hit. And I put so much into it of my own thoughts. And then what it spits out is never perfect, is never even close to perfect. But I can recognize which pieces to pull out, what to change, how to piece it together in a way that makes sense. But if you don't have the experience of doing that on your own, you know, just on pen and paper, then you're not gonna be able to recognize AI's output as good or bad. And then you deal with, like the Coca-Cola thing, like, or whatever. You can tell when someone has just copy and pasted something from AI. And I will never do that because it's never good, but I have the experience to creative direct it, essentially. So that's why I tell younger people to just not use it. If they're going to use it, I say, use it as a thesaurus or a phrase finder or, a research tool or something, but you need to do all the thinking and crafting on your own.
Yeah. There's a kind of a the role that you're talking about for yourself is as a curator. The creative director
Mhm.
is kind of like the evaluator and kind of curator of things. And like you, I think of them as like infinite interns. And I
Mhm.
certainly don't expect A plus work every time in every capacity from an intern. It's like if the intern can overturn one or two small insights or stones that I didn't have that I didn't find, great. Like I'm looking for, oh, perfect. There's two or three words that
Mhm.
keeps me moving, helps me address a few things, or, oh yeah, that's a way of summarizing things or organizing things. Fantastic. Thank you, interns. They're always over here on the second monitor. How are you finding like interactions with clients? Are they like, how are they asking you about your use of AI on their work, on their business?
I actually don't think I've ever been asked about that. No one brings it up. I read all of my contracts very carefully, and I've never seen anything about AI in there. I I never put, um, brand names into I use Gemini over ChatGPT. Um, I try to keep any, like, identifying information out. I'll just kinda put, like, insert brand name here or something.
Right.
Um, so I'm never using any, like, proprietary information or anything in the AI. But, yeah, I've never had someone say, "Don't use AI," or "Are
Oh,
you?" I think as long as you're giving them something that is the quality that they would expect from you, I think it's fine. Um, it saves a lot of time too. I'm someone who really struggles with just starting something.
mm,
Like, the
yeah.
blank page is really hard for me, and so AI is what kinda cuts that time in half for me. It
Mhm.
just gives me a place to start, and then I'm on a roll. So, it's a time saver in that capacity for me. Um, but most of what I give a client, it's probably, 80 to 90% me. So, they've never brought it up, fortunately.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're going to, in the next couple of years, as the technology is sort of more codified, as kind of like
Mhm.
Microsoft kind of settles in, as Google settles in, as the various, bespoke, specific, like I play around with A Daily, I play around with Synapse, which are sort of like AI platforms designed for creative people, designed for
Mm.
strategists, designed for advertising. Um, and they're brand new. They're early stages, and so are they perfect? Of course not. You know,
Yeah.
but you're starting to see ways in which these tools, you know, like make the process of, oh, I need to take a business problem and solve it with creativity. Like starting to see ways in which these tools are shortcutting certain steps and or extending range and kind of
Mhm.
helping, like alas, I need to sleep, I need to eat, I have children, to raise, a family to live within. And so to have kind of extended range is a gift,
Mhm.
and every once in a while, like a good partner, an AI might suggest something where it's like, oh, actually that right there, who would have thunk? That
Yep.
might trigger something, or help solve a craft problem or a production problem.
That's a
Um,
great point too, because I, as a freelancer, often work alone.
mm,
So I don't have that partner to bounce things off of. So AI can be a nice stand-in for that in a
yeah,
pinch.
yeah. I mean, the Socratic dialogue, or even, I had worked with a client, again as a solo, um, had a strategy, and just kind of, for shits and grins, like, okay, ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude, sort of my three sparring partners.
Mhm.
I gave them some background information. I gave them the strategy, and I said, "This is an old exercise that my old boss, Bill Heater, had suggested, is like, give me 5 reasons why this strategy is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Like,
Mm.
poke holes in it, 5 distinct reasons why what we're proposing is just harebrained lunacy," And lo and behold, a couple of really smart things popped up that was like, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that."
Mm.
And what it helped me do is prepare for the inevitable client presentation. And so, you know, it allowed me to kind of make some adjustments and kind of, I'm limited by my perspective. I'm a white dude that lives in Minnesota and, whatever. And so I may not see things the way you would see them or someone in Sao Paulo would see them, et cetera. Um, and so to have kind of that perspective helped me kind of walk into, because of course, what does the client do? They ask the uncomfortable question about, like, well, have you thought about? And it's like,
Mhm.
you know what? I had thought about that.
Yeah, I'm ready for it.
And so like I had an analogy, I had an answer to help them go like, oh yeah, okay, all right. And I mean, ultimately it kind of gave me greater confidence to sell in that strategy. And I think that like having those kind of sparring partners is a thing
Mm.
that's going to become even more and more useful as things
Yeah.
move on. So
I feel
ki
like that would be a great, exercise for people who are trying to practice with presentations because
mm,
I think one of the hardest things for me, like, as I was, going through my career is learning how to spar with the clients and how to
mm,
come up with an answer off the top of my head when we're in the meeting or give
yeah,
some rationale that I hadn't thought of yet. And usually you can only get better at that through practice with real clients. So
mhm,
using AI for something like that, where you can ask it to give you some questions that the client might ask you, that
right.
could be really, really great practice for that.
Yeah, and it's free, and it's
Yeah,
non-judgmental, and
right.
it will do it at whenever, 2 o'clock in the morning. Great. You wanna ask the same
Mhm.
question over and over? Fine, you know?
Yep.
So so let's project into the future, like, like 5 years from now, it's 2030. We've seen so much change. Like, if you were to predict the future, like, what does the ad business look like in 2030? What do you
First of all,
imagine?
20, 30, 5 years from now is insane to think about. Um,
Right.
gosh. I I think freelance seems to be becoming more of the norm, kind of
Mhm.
contract gig economy. sort of structure. And I think
Hmm.
that's going to continue to be the case, especially with whatever's going to happen to the economy in the next couple of years. Um, I kind of wonder if the ad industry will go in some sort of direction similar to Hollywood, where
Mm.
it's totally normal to sort of assemble a team for every
Hmm.
project. We're
Yep.
all these kind of like loose, freelancers or contractors and with our different niches and then we come together for a project and then we split up and
Yeah.
maybe we'll work together in the future on a different thing. I think that could be really interesting and it still um, solves the problem of getting rid of overhead and stuff, but then we're all just
Yeah.
I don't know, I
S-
kinda like that.
So Boston, mid 1990s, there's an art director, a guy named Tom Simons, Partners in Simons. Tom was an art director who ultimately was a very astute business person. So he looked around and kind of like, I'm going to go to Harvard, get my MBA because I'm smarter than the people around me. And so his entire agency was predicated. He wrote a whole white paper called The Hollywood Model. And there were basically five full-time people. One was like an accountant, one was a legal person or whatever. Everybody who worked for the agency was it was a Hollywood model. Like you're
Mm,
the art director, you're the writer, you'd come in on projects. And so
mhm.
the clients had someone, Tom and a few others who were sort of full time, but they also understood that Tom could put a team together in like 24 hours.
Right.
Um, or not or whatever, and that they weren't paying for overhead. So the Hollywood model has been out
Hmm,
there. Kudos to
interesting.
Tom Simons, but yeah, and where do you imagine like your career in terms of like the TikTok? Do you want that to continue and evolve and propel? Like ultimately, you could be kind of like the grand dame of advertising influence through TikTok. Where would you like to go?
I ask myself that all the time, and I don't know the answer quite yet. I think I do want it to grow. I I think for the next year, my plan is to do sort of 50-50, 50% freelance, 50% stuff about advertising. Um, because up until now, I've really just been using free time to do stuff about advertising. If freelance is a little slow or I finish my work early or something, I do stuff about advertising. And I think that's been fine. But now that I'm ready for it to grow, I do need to put more time and energy into it because it's not going to grow otherwise. So I've talked to my husband. We've got a plan for, me kind of cutting back on freelance work for the next year and seeing where things go. I think it would be amazing to become almost like a media company or something like that.
Mhm.
It's hard because I am stuck in between education and the media side of things. I
Mm.
love dissecting creative. I love talking about industry news and I still want to do that, but I also really want to educate and I want to help people get into this industry and I want to help mid-level people thrive and get better and get promoted and all that stuff. So I have these sort of two sides of this brand, and it's figuring out how to put those things together in a way that's gonna be lucrative enough for me to do it more often. So, that's kind of the struggle that I'm experiencing right now, and I think the next year, hopefully, I'll see a lot more growth with it.
Well, I'll just say from my perspective, I think you're talking about you represent two sides of the same coin, which is yes, you are talking about whatever's in the news today in the world of
Mhm.
advertising and design, but it's the way that you talk about it and the way that you don't just say a thing exists. What I see from your style is this thing exists, and I think we need to talk about why or
Mhm.
how or the mechanisms that are kind of lurking underneath the visual or the narrative or the structure of whatever it is you're kind of examining. And I do think that that's kind of your what makes you distinct is that um, you're not just reporting on, you're helping the audience. Advertising is one of those subjects where, of course, everybody understands it. How hard could it be? Um,
Yeah.
it's kind of like the butt of a joke, right? And yet we know that there's a very intricate
Mhm.
clockwork of delicate machinery that and personalities that ultimately lead to great work or not great work. And and your ability to deconstruct something and help us see, oh, there's actually intention, there's actually craft, there's actually purposefulness, in
Mhm.
this particular piece of work. I find it really helpful. You have made for me a lot of current advertising work more relatable and certainly more enjoyable. So I encourage you to keep doing it.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm glad that that comes across because I do try to dissect and when I have something critical to say, I try to make sure there's something we can learn from it.
Mhm,
Um, I never wanna just hate on something just to
mhm,
hate on it. There are certainly things that I would love to just hate on, but I will never do that unless I have some value to add on top of it.
yeah,
Um, and it is interesting because at least on TikTok, I've noticed that there's a lot of advertising work that goes viral outside of the industry,
yes.
and usually, there's a lot of misconceptions and things that are attached to that. So I
Right.
like, an example is, Bumble when their billboard went viral a couple months ago because it had a slightly offensive headline, and I think
Yeah.
the commentary outside of the industry was Bumble hates women and they did this on purpose. And
Mhm.
what I talked about was like, yes, this was offensive. It did not come across how they probably intended it, but let me tell you the process. Let me tell you how they put a headline together with an image. Like this I don't think this was done on purpose. I don't think this was malicious because of all these reasons and because of how the advertising world works. So I think having that extra context is really helpful, especially for people who are coming in from the outside and learning about advertising, so I love being that person, and I definitely wanna continue doing that.
Well, kudos to you. Keep going.
Thank you.
Keep going. Hey, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate your insights and for all the work that you're doing. You got to keep going. Keep doing it.
Thank you. I
I'm not
appreciate
the
it.
only one who loves what you're doing.
I appreciate it.
There you have it. Ashley Rutstein. Stuff about advertising. Isn't she smart? Thank you, Ashley, for sharing your history and perspective with us. Folks, you can find Ashley on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Just search for Stuff About Advertising. That's all one word, Stuff About Advertising. And I'll share Ashley's links in the show notes. I've got a few more interviews like this one lined up, a few in the editing bay, soon to be released. If content like this meant something to you, please share it with someone, even one person. Hey, I think you should check this out. That would mean everything to me. All right, keep strengthening your curiosity muscles. I'll see you next time.